In the middle of the night on a quiet September morning in 2015, piercing screams shattered the silence of a normally peaceful Bristol neighborhood. Neighbors peeked through their windows, shocked to see a man stumbling outside wearing only his underwear. His skin looked like it was covered in mud or dirt, but it would turn out to be neither. As neighbors tried to assist the frantic man, it didn't take long for them to realize that the dark substance on the man's skin was not mud. It was his own skin, disintegrating and falling off in clumps as he pleaded for help. The man was in unimaginable agony, and despite their efforts, there was little the neighbors could do to help him. Paramedics arrived and even they marveled at the extent of the man's beyond harrowing condition. But it was only the beginning. The case would soon reveal the horrifying depths to which human cruelty could descend. Welcome back to Crime A to Z, where we detail cases and criminals from their very beginning until well after other reporting ends. Today, we'll be covering the deeply tragic case of Mark van Dongen, a talented young engineer whose life took a dark turn after a toxic relationship escalated into cruelty you can't even begin to imagine. This case is not just about the horrific act itself, but the unbearably devastating consequences that followed. Consequences so severe that in the end, the unthinkable choice became the only bearable one. Let's dive in. And before we get started, if you like how we present this case, we'd love if you can spare a quick moment of your time to hit like and subscribe, please. Let's go. Mark van Dongen was a Dutch national, born and raised in the Netherlands. Mark's father, Cornelius van Dongen, known by the common Dutch nickname Kees, described Mark as a compassionate child, recognized for his kindness, empathy, and ambition. Even as a young boy, Mark showed a tender heart, sometimes returning marbles to friends after winning them so they would not feel bad. In college, Mark studied civil engineering, where he excelled academically. He was ambitious and highly driven. He strived to succeed both academically and professionally. After completing his studies in the Netherlands, Mark relocated to Bristol, UK, to continue his studies and start looking for work opportunities in his field. His move to the UK marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. It was during this new chapter that Mark met Berlina Wallace, a fashion student from South Africa nearly 20 years his senior. Mark and Berlina began dating in 2010, and their relationship initially looked promising, with the pair quickly becoming close. They moved in with each other and seemed committed to building a life together, with Mark deeply invested in the relationship and even supporting Berlina both emotionally and financially. But over time, problems arose as Berlina started to become emotionally volatile and controlling. Mark's friends and family grew increasingly concerned as they witnessed Berlina's emotional manipulation and frequent outbursts of anger. The couple's arguments would escalate as Berlina tried to control many aspects of Mark's life. Friends saw visible evidence of her violence, namely scratches on Mark's body, and learned that Berlina had once poured boiling water on Mark as he slept. When he sought treatment for it, he told the doctor that he had accidentally tipped tea over himself. In private, he confided in friends that Berlina had either hurt or threatened him on numerous occasions. Each time Mark would try to distance himself, Berlina would resort to emotional blackmail, including threats of self-harm, trapping him between his desire to leave and concern for her well-being. Despite the turmoil, Mark stayed in the relationship for 5 years. By August of 2015, Mark had reached his breaking point. He decided it was time to break up with Berlina. Seeking a fresh start, he met another woman named Violet Farquharson online, and they soon began a new relationship. But Berlina did not let go so easily, sending Mark a series of emotional texts laced with guilt and threats. Mark tried to maintain peace by offering to continue supporting Berlina financially even after their breakup, hoping to prevent her from spiraling further. But she continued to become even more volatile, and her jealousy turned into an obsession. She started stalking Mark and harassed both him and his new girlfriend with silent phone calls. Mark reported feeling fearful of Berlina, particularly after she threatened to harm herself. According to one friend, she even threatened to perform that self-harm, then make it appear as though Mark was responsible. Mark confided in both his father and friends that he was afraid of what Berlina might do next, but he also felt obligated to check on her periodically for both of their sakes. Then, in September of 2015, in an attempt to end things amicably once and for all, Mark visited Berlina's flat one final time. Mark told his new girlfriend, Violet, of his intentions to sever all ties with Berlina, then headed to her flat around 10 p.m. Once he arrived, the conversation quickly turned heated. Berlina refused to accept that Mark had moved on, clinging to their relationship despite his efforts to break things off. According to Violet, Berlina told Mark that she would go stay at a hotel for the night. So Mark ended up staying the night at Berlina's, and not just at her flat, but in her bed. It was an odd narrative of events given Berlina's supposed plan to leave for a hotel, raising questions about Mark's account to Violet and the true nature of the evening. At around 3 a.m., as Mark lay asleep in just his boxer shorts, he was shaken awake by Berlina. Startled, he woke up to Berlina telling him that, "If I can't have you, no one will." Then, before Mark could react, Berlina threw sulfuric acid directly onto his face, then onto his body. The liquid burned instantly, searing through his skin and muscles. Mark screamed in agony as he scrambled out of the bed in unbearable pain. Barely able to see, he stumbled out of the flat and into the street, his skin melting away in clumps. He screamed for help, his voice waking neighbors who rushed to their windows. At first, they thought it was a prank. One neighbor thought the commotion was caused by wailing foxes, grabbed a golf club, and ran outside. Another neighbor initially thought Mark was covered in mud. To both of them, it became horrifyingly clear that it was a man in agony, and that his skin, not mud, was melting off of his body. Neighbors guided Mark into a nearby flat and put him in a cold shower, desperately trying to ease his pain. Despite their efforts, the damage was already done. When paramedics arrived, Mark was foaming at the mouth, blinded, and in unimaginable pain. One paramedic noticed that the iris of his left eye had been completely melted. To paramedics, it was obvious that Mark's injuries were catastrophic. His face and upper body were covered in deep chemical burns, with the acid eating through his skin and muscle tissue. Mark was barely able to speak through the pain, his words slurred as he gasped for air. His body convulsed from the shock, and acid residue still clung to parts of his skin, intensifying the damage with every second. Despite his agony, Mark managed to identify Berlina as his attacker. He begged the paramedics to check on his new girlfriend, fearing that she might also be targeted by Berlina. But she was not. His girlfriend was completely fine. In fact, Berlina was still in her flat, sitting calmly, unmoved by Mark's piercing screams echoing through the neighborhood in the middle of the night. Instead of calling for help, Berlina picked up the phone and called a friend, showing no sign of remorse whatsoever for the unbearable suffering she directly caused. The paramedics worked quickly, administering oxygen and pain relief to combat his labored breathing and stabilize him. As he was being rushed to the hospital, police officers arrived at the scene to investigate. They quickly gathered information from neighbors, who confirmed how Mark had identified Berlina as his attacker. Their observations, combined with Mark's account to paramedics, gave police enough cause to act swiftly. They arrived at Berlina's flat and found her sitting calmly on the sofa, showing no visible signs of distress. Despite the chaos unfolding just outside her door, she remained indifferent, offering no assistance to the person she attacked. Officers noted her detached demeanor. They took her into custody, arresting her on suspicion of causing grievous bodily harm. Meanwhile, back at her flat, police collected the acid bottle she had used, which was now missing its original label, a clear indication of her intent to conceal what it contained. Law enforcement also seized Berlina's electronic devices, hoping to uncover evidence of premeditation. Berlina's behavior remained eerily calm throughout the initial stages of her arrest. As police began questioning her, she insisted that she had no idea the bottle contained acid, claiming instead that she thought it was water. Back at the hospital, the trauma team observed burns covering 25% of Mark's body, with many areas of exposed flesh already turning black. It was clear to the medical team that they were dealing with one of the worst acid attacks they had ever seen. As his condition deteriorated, doctors moved Mark to the intensive care unit, where he was placed into an induced coma to give his body a chance to stabilize and cope with the trauma. His left leg, already showing signs of poor circulation from the acid exposure, raised immediate concerns among the doctors. Meanwhile, police proceeded with their investigation. What they uncovered was weeks of meticulous planning and a disturbing state of mind leading up to the attack. Investigators spoke to Mark's friends and family, who provided insights into Berlina's volatile and manipulative behavior toward Mark, especially in the final months of their relationship, including the boiling water incident. They painted a relationship of escalating violence and control that culminated in the attack. They also gathered evidence of Berlina's own admissions to therapists that she had anger issues dating back as far as her teenage years, including her telling one psychiatric nurse the year before the attack that she gets an adrenaline rush when someone says the wrong thing to her, and that she feels like she could destroy everything around her when that occurs. Then, there was the purchase of the acid. On September 2nd, Berlina ordered a bottle of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid from Amazon. After receiving it, she deliberately removed the label which stated that the acid causes severe burns and eye damage to conceal what the bottle contained. Law enforcement contended that she did so to prevent detection of the colorless substance, making it impossible for anyone unfamiliar with the contents to recognize it as sulfuric acid. A search of Berlina's electronic devices revealed that her choice of sulfuric acid was by no means random. In the weeks leading up to the attack, she had performed 82 searches related to sulfuric acid, visiting dozens of websites, including reading about the long-term injuries and physical damage inflicted on victims and reviewing detailed case studies of previous attacks. The extent of her search history made it clear that the attack was not impulsive. It was carefully planned. And then there was the fact that Berlina made no attempt, had no desire whatsoever to assist Mark after her brutal attack. As the acid instantly took effect and sent Mark into the most excruciating pain imaginable, Berlina sat back and reveled in the suffering she caused, demonstrating to authorities her complete level of maliciousness and callousness to be able to ignore someone writhing in such excruciating agony. All the evidence led investigators to the conclusion that the attack was deliberate and premeditated, despite Berlina's claim to the contrary. Berlina continued to deny that she intended to harm Mark. She claimed she believed the bottle contained water, not acid, and went as far as suggesting that Mark had planted the acid to deceive her into drinking it. Investigators found this hard to believe. In fact, during their investigation, they discovered that one of her internet searches led her to a source containing a strikingly similar scenario, nearly identical to the acid planting accusation she made against Mark. After being placed in a medically induced coma, Mark spent 4 months in intensive care as doctors at Southmead Hospital fought to stabilize him. When he finally awoke, the full extent of his injuries became devastatingly clear. As a result of neuropathy he suffered from the loss of use of his muscles, Mark was paralyzed from the neck down, unable to move anything except his tongue. The acid had burned so deeply into his lower left leg that amputation was the only option to prevent further complications. Despite their efforts to save as much of the limb as possible, the damage was too extensive, and his leg had to be removed below the knee. The acid had eaten away his facial features, leaving him partially blind and with severe disfigurement. The moment Mark saw his reflection for the first time, he was devastated. He sadly exclaimed, "Kill me now. If this is what I look like, I don't want to live." Despite the support of his father and medical staff, Mark understandably struggled emotionally. He communicated using an alphabet board, painstakingly pointing to letters with his tongue. It was a slow, exhausting process, but it was the only way he could express himself. The overwhelming loss of independence combined with the constant physical pain plunged him into a deep depression. His father, Keys, stayed by his side, trying to lift his spirits, but Mark's emotional health deteriorated rapidly. The police documented the case meticulously, but Mark's injuries were so severe that officers decided never to release photos, not even to the media. In November 2016, Mark was transferred to a care home in Gloucester, but the conditions there were deplorable. Keys drove 800 miles to visit his son, only to find him covered in his own feces, crying out for help. The sight was heartbreaking and Keys vowed to get him out. With the help of friends, the family arranged for a private ambulance to transfer Mark to Belgium, where they hoped he would receive better care. Even in Belgium, however, Mark's suffering continued. The acid had burned through membranes and bone, leaving holes in his body that caused constant, excruciating pain. The medical staff in Belgium did their best, but the hospital lacked a ward specifically equipped to care for someone with injuries as severe as Mark's. Every nerve in Mark's body seemed to be on fire, and the holes in his bones caused relentless pain. Mark grew increasingly despondent, so despite the progress he was actually making, like finally being able to speak again, he asked his father, "What's the point if all I can do is look at the ceiling?" Then, as if his suffering wasn't enough, Mark's condition worsened when he developed a severe lung infection. Treating the infection would require a tracheotomy or tube inserted into his throat. The procedure would save his life, but it would also take away his ability to speak. a small but vital comfort that had allowed him to maintain some connection with his father. For Mark, this was the final blow. Facing a life of paralysis, unrelenting pain, and now silence, Mark told his father that he could not go on any longer. With his family's support, Mark applied for voluntary euthanasia, which is legal in Belgium under certain conditions. His application was reviewed by 3 medical specialists, all of whom confirmed that Mark's was a case of unbearable suffering, both physical and psychological. They approved his request. So, on January 2nd, 2017, Mark spent his final moments with his father, who he had asked to stay by his side until the very end. At 7:15 p.m., doctors inserted a catheter into Mark's heart, ending his life and suffering at the age of 29. Berlina Wallace's trial began in April 2018, nearly 3 years after the attack. She pleaded not guilty to murder and manslaughter, insisting that she believed she was throwing water, not acid. However, her version of events quickly fell apart under scrutiny. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that the attack was both malicious and premeditated. They detailed Berlina's purchase of concentrated sulfuric acid, her deliberate removal of the label, and the extensive online searches she conducted on acid attacks. They argued that Berlina's intent was not just to harm, but to permanently disfigure Mark, ensuring that no other woman would ever want him again. Witnesses testified to Berlina's controlling and abusive behavior, painting a picture of a toxic relationship fueled by jealousy and manipulation. Mark's death, which occurred months after the attack, complicated the charges. Although Mark initially survived the attack, his catastrophic injuries were what led him to seek euthanasia. The prosecution contended that Berlina's actions directly caused Mark's death, so a charge of murder was brought before the jury. But with euthanasia being involved, the jury had to consider whether her actions were the sole cause of his death or whether there were any other contributing factors. Berlina's defense attorneys argued that since Mark voluntarily ended his life, Berlina could not be held fully accountable for his death. In the end, the jury was not convinced that Berlina's actions met the legal threshold for murder or manslaughter. So, the jury found Berlina not guilty, but both murder and manslaughter, leaving many people stunned. They did, however, find her guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent, a serious charge that carried a significant sentence. For the sentencing, the judge delivered a powerful statement that perfectly reflected both Berlina's ruthlessness as well as the extreme devastation she inflicted. The judge stated, in part, "On the 2nd of September 2015, you bought a liter of 98% concentrated sulfuric acid. If necessary, your intention was to use the acid to attack Mark van Dongen because you wanted to and had left you for another woman. You removed the label from the bottle containing the colorless fluid, which stated that the acid causes severe burns and eye damage. You did so to prevent detection of the acid in your home. You chose your moment for the attack. It occurred when Mark van Dongen, wearing only boxer shorts, was asleep in the bed which you had shared in your flat. Vulnerable, almost naked, he awoke but had no real opportunity to avoid the focus of your acid attack, namely his face and then his body. The burns which Mark sustained covered 2/3 of his face and a large percentage of his upper chest, arms, and upper thighs. The burns were almost all full thickness, affecting 25% of his total body space. As a result of skin graft procedures, over 40% of Mark's total body area was affected by the burns. A consultant in burn surgery said there had been no equivalent patient with similar extensive injuries following a chemical attack. Mark spent a total period of 11 months in the intensive care unit. He underwent a number of operative procedures. His left leg had to be amputated. He lost the sight in his left eye, and damage was caused to the sight in his right eye. The doctors had to use the strongest pain relief, which in themselves caused difficult side effects. For 4 months, Mark was not really able to communicate. He sustained not only burns, but injury to the systems of his body. When in ICU, he suffered recurrent chest infections, septicemic shock, his kidneys were injured, there were problems with his gut and bleeding from a bowel. His heartbeat and liver function were altered. At the time of his discharge from the hospital in November 2016, he was paralyzed from the neck down with no movement in his upper arms and legs. Had Mark survived, there would have been further operations. He would have required extensive care for the rest of his life. Another treating clinician said that his physical appearance would never be restored to anything which could be described as normal. He had been permanently and irrevocably, drastically disfigured. The facial scarring was categorized at the severe end of very severe scarring. Rowlena Wallace was sentenced to a minimum of 12 years in prison. Rowlena Wallace's conviction and sentence sparked mixed reactions. While her conviction offered some sense of justice, many, including Mark's family, felt the sentence was insufficient given the extent of his suffering. The case also reignited public debate over the use of acid as a weapon, prompting discussions about stricter regulations and harsher penalties for acid attacks. This heightened attention contributed to the enactment of the 2019 Offensive Weapons Act. The act imposed age restrictions on buying corrosive products and restricted home deliveries for certain high-concentration substances. Many retailers also began tightening their policies voluntarily to limit sales and better regulate purchases of these dangerous chemicals. Following Rowlena's conviction, Mark Van Dongen's family struggled to find closure. In the wake of what they felt was an insufficient sentence, they became vocal advocates for stricter laws on acid sales and harsher penalties for such attacks, hoping to prevent others from suffering a similar fate. Once Mark passed away, his younger brothers set up a crowdfunding page to help support their father, whose life had been both emotionally and financially devastated by his youngest son's horrific battle. On the page, his brother described how their father had spent months traveling back and forth to Bristol, sleeping in his car in the hospital parking lot to save money. He recounted the unimaginable suffering Mark endured, including his paralysis, losing his leg, eye, and ear, and how the continuous itching of his scars drove Mark out of his mind. The funds would go toward helping their father get his life back on track, just ahead of him having to begin traveling back to the UK for Rowlena's trial. With support from over 1,600 supporters, they received nearly 150% of their fundraising target. As a chilling and somber reminder of the sheer viciousness of the attack, the doorbell that Mark rang for help at a neighbor's home still bears the corrosive scars of the attack, a haunting reminder to neighbors of the horror that took place. Rowlena Wallace began serving her prison sentence immediately in a UK prison. Specific details about which prison she was sent to are not publicly available due to privacy policies surrounding inmate placements. She will be eligible for parole consideration in 2027. However, her release will depend on behavior and other factors evaluated by the parole board at that time. In public statements, Kees Van Dongen has expressed hope that Rowlena will struggle to meet the conditions necessary for release, reflecting the family's belief that her actions deserve a longer sentence than the minimum term set by the court.
Mark was mijn kind, het was mijn jong. Hij is altijd bij mij geweest en we hebben het. Ik hoop dat het niemand, maar dan ook niemand, ooit nog overkomt als vader of moeder of als...
We hope this video did justice to Mark Van Dongen. We cannot begin to imagine the pain he endured, nor the profound sadness his family had to bear as they were forced to watch their loved one suffer so deeply. What are your thoughts? Should Rowlena Wallace have faced a harsher punishment? Do you believe justice was served? Let us know in the comments. And if you like how we covered this case, please hit like, share, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any of our upcoming videos.